In today's video, we're breaking down every execution carried out across the United States this year. 16 people have already been put to death in 2026, across 4 different states, each one by lethal injection. That's a lot of ground to cover, so we're splitting this into parts. Today, we're covering 5 of those cases in full detail. Stay until the end, because you'll hear the crimes that put them here, the final hours before they died, and the last words they spoke before it was over. And if you want the rest of the 16, make sure you're subscribed, because the next cases are coming soon. Case 1. Charles Victor Thompson. Charles Victor Thompson was 27 years old in 1997, working sales jobs around Houston, when he met Glenda Denise Hazlip in the bar scene that defined so many of his nights. Denise was 39, a nail technician, and a mother. Her 13-year-old son, Wade, was the fixed point in a life that had only recently come apart after her divorce. What started between her and Thompson looked, at first, like something simple. Friendship. Then something more. He told her he'd take care of her and her boy. It didn't take long for that promise to curdle. Thompson drank heavily and used cocaine, and the more his addiction deepened, the more his grip on Denise tightened. Control, jealousy, then violence, bruises she couldn't always hide from her co-workers, a black eye, and a split lip, Thompson himself later admitted to causing, though he insisted it was the only time he'd ever raised a hand to her. It wasn't. After a year of this, Denise finally found the strength to walk away for good. She found something different in Darren Kane, a 30-year-old bartender from the same bar where she and Thompson had first crossed paths. Where Thompson brought chaos, Kane brought steadiness. Calm, loyal, protective. Everyone who knew him said the same thing. For Denise, he must have felt like proof that something better existed. Thompson never accepted the breakup. He stalked her, called at all hours, showed up outside her apartment, demanding to know where she stood, threatening her if she didn't come back. And on the night of April 29th, 1998, that pressure finally broke into violence. At 2:30 in the morning, Kane's phone rang. Denise, crying, terrified. Thompson was inside her apartment, and he wasn't leaving quietly. Kane drove straight there, and what followed was a 15-minute brawl between the two men, ending with Kane on top, and Thompson begging, apologizing, suddenly compliant. Kane, in a moment that would cost him everything, extended his hand. They sat outside together, shared a beer. When a deputy responding to a disturbance call arrived, he found 3 people who looked, impossibly, at peace. But peace was never real. Thompson drove home, retrieved a semi-automatic pistol, and came back 3 hours later, just after 6 in the morning, when Denise and Darren likely believed the night was finally over. He kicked the door in. Kane rose to meet him and was shot 4 times before he understood what was happening. Twice through the chest, once in the back as he tried to run. Even collapsing, even dying, Kane grabbed at Thompson's leg, some last desperate attempt to buy Denise time to escape. It wasn't enough. Thompson fired one final shot into the back of Kane's neck, execution style, then turned toward Denise as she fled for the kitchen. He caught her, reloaded, deliberately, investigators would later prove, pressed the gun to her cheek, and told her he could shoot her too. Then he did. Denise survived the initial shot, though the damage was catastrophic. Shattered teeth, a torn tongue, blood everywhere. A neighbor found her sitting in a spreading pool of blood and asked if Thompson had done this. She nodded. That single gesture would matter later. Thompson fled, dumped the gun in a nearby creek, then, in a decision that still puzzles people who study this case, didn't run. He confessed to a friend, called his father, and turned himself in that same morning. Denise fought for a week, airlifted to Houston, placed on life support, her heart rate dropping until the damage to her brain became irreversible. On May 6, 1998, exactly 7 days after the shooting, she died. Her son Wade heard the news at school, from a classmate who barely understood what she was saying. He'd already warned his mother about Thompson. He'd already seen the bruises. Decades later, Wade would say part of him never left that morning. While awaiting trial, Thompson made a mistake that revealed exactly who he was underneath the remorse. He tried to arrange the murder of a witness against him, unaware the man he approached was working with police. A recorded meeting captured him negotiating a price for a killing, $1,500, cold and specific. In April 1999, A jury needed little time to convict him of capital murder. Then came the part of this story that turned Thompson into something closer to legend than criminal. In November 2005, using a fake ID and clothes he'd smuggled into his cell, Thompson simply walked out of the Harris County Jail, past guards, through the visitation area, out the front door. For 3 days he was a fugitive, making it 200 miles to Louisiana, at one point posing as a Hurricane Katrina survivor to explain his lack of identification. Authorities found him outside a liquor store in Shreveport, drunk, and he gave up his name without a fight. He spent the next 20 years on death row. In September 2025, his execution warrant was finally signed, setting his death for January 28, 2026, at the Huntsville unit. That morning, he woke around 6:30, spent his final hours with his attorneys and a spiritual advisor, and ate the standard prison meal. Texas offers no special last request. No family came to see him off. At 6 that evening, he was strapped to the gurney. When asked for final words, he didn't hesitate. He apologized. He told everyone watching to keep Jesus first. He said there were no winners here, that this kind of violence only creates more victims, more trauma, decades after the fact. He asked for forgiveness so the people he'd hurt could finally heal. Then the injection began. Witnesses noted brief signs of discomfort, irregular breathing, before he lost consciousness. At 6:15, he was pronounced dead. Case 2. Ronald Palmer Heath. Ronald Palmer Heath's story begins long before the date on his death warrant. In 1977, he was a 16-year-old kid in Jacksonville, Florida, already drifting toward violence. That December, he met 18-year-old Michael Green. The two spent several hours together and appeared to get along, but whatever happened between them that day ended in a brutal attack. Heath later claimed that Green had made unwanted sexual advances toward him. Whether that was true or an excuse, the outcome was the same. Heath stabbed Green over and over, then placed the seriously wounded young man in his car and drove aimlessly for more than an hour instead of trying to save him. When he finally stopped, he pulled Green out, stabbed him again, tried to burn him inside the vehicle, and when Green managed to escape the flames, Heath chased him down and beat him to death with a tree branch. The savagery of the killing stunned everyone who later saw the autopsy photos and read the case file. For that first murder, committed before he was even old enough to vote, Heath pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The court sentenced him to 30 years in prison. On paper, that should have taken him well into middle age. In reality, he served only around a decade. In 1988, he was released on parole, nearly 20 years early. The decision would turn out to be catastrophic. Within 6 months of regaining his freedom, Ronald Heath killed again, and this time, he did not act alone. On the night of May 24, 1989, Heath was at the Purple Porpoise Lounge in Gainesville with his younger brother Kenneth, who was 24. The brothers were living a transient, unstable life, bouncing between odd jobs, drinking heavily, and spending much of their time in bars. Inside the Purple Porpoise that night was Michael Sheridan, a 30-year-old traveling salesman from Atlanta, Georgia. Sheridan had stopped in for dinner and a few drinks, the kind of routine stop he probably made on countless trips. He was outgoing and trusting. He struck up a conversation with the Heath brothers, bought them drinks, and asked if they had marijuana or wanted to smoke. For Ronald, that was enough to mark Sheridan as a target. Quietly, he suggested to Kenneth that they take Sheridan somewhere secluded and rob him. Kenneth agreed. The three men left together in Kenneth's car, with Ronald behind the wheel. He drove to a remote wooded area south of Gainesville in Alachua County. Out there, in the dark, away from the bar's noise, they smoked marijuana and talked like nothing awful was about to happen. When Ronald decided it was time, he gave Kenneth a silent signal, forming his hand into the shape of a gun. Kenneth pulled out a .38 caliber revolver and pointed it at Sheridan, demanding his wallet, his gold chain, and his watch. Sheridan refused, confused, and trying to understand how the friendly conversation had turned into a robbery. Following Ronald's orders, Kenneth shot Sheridan in the chest. Sheridan collapsed, clutching the wound and crying out in pain, struggling to remove his jewelry and empty his pockets fast enough to satisfy the brothers. For Ronald, it still wasn't enough. He walked up to the wounded salesman, kicked him while he lay on the ground, and pulled a hunting knife. He tried to slit Sheridan's throat, but the blade was too dull to finish the job. So he turned back to his brother and gave one more instruction. Kenneth fired 2 shots into Sheridan's head. The victim died there in the woods. They hid the body in thick brush and drove back to the Purple Porpoise Lounge, where they rummaged through Sheridan's rental car and took more of his belongings. For several days, the body lay undiscovered. When investigators finally found Sheridan on May 30, 1989, he was already in an advanced state of decomposition. The medical examiner concluded he had been dead between 3 and 10 days, killed by multiple gunshot wounds and a deep stab wound to the neck. Just 2 days after the Sheridan murder, the Heath brothers repeated the pattern, this time in Jacksonville. On May 26, 1989, they met 26-year-old Anthony Hammett at a bar in the Arlington neighborhood. They lured him out, drove him to a secluded area, and when Hammett realized he was being robbed and tried to run, he was shot once in the back and left for dead. Formal charges were eventually brought against Ronald for Hammett's murder, but those charges were later dropped when Kenneth refused to testify against his brother, saying he had received threats. The Hammett case never resulted in a conviction, leaving his family without legal closure. It was Sheridan's case that ultimately held. The Heath brothers made a critical mistake after killing Sheridan. They tried to use his stolen credit card to buy a car stereo. The transaction was declined, triggering an alert that drew the attention of authorities. Investigators from the Gainesville Police Department and the Alachua County Sheriff's Office began tracking purchases attempted with Sheridan's credit cards at the Oaks Mall. Piece by piece, they reconstructed the suspect's movements after the murder. The trail led back to the brothers. Several weeks later, officers found Ronald living in a trailer in Douglas, Georgia, with a woman identified as Powell. During the arrest, police recovered clothing purchased with the stolen cards, Sheridan's watch, and other items that tied directly to the homicide. Kenneth was also arrested. Ronald's trial took place in 1990 in an Alachua County courtroom. This time, Kenneth agreed to testify in exchange for his own life. Under a plea deal, he would receive a life sentence and avoid the death penalty if he cooperated against his older brother. On the stand, Kenneth described in detail what had happened that night in the woods: the robbery, the first shot, Ronald's kicks, the attempt to slit Sheridan's throat, and the final 2 shots to the head. His testimony became the backbone of the prosecution's case. On November 15, 1990, the jury found Ronald Palmer Heath guilty of first-degree murder. 2 days later, Judge Robert Cates sentenced him to death for the killing of Michael Sheridan. Ronald returned to death row, this time in Florida, beginning a second long stretch of incarceration that would ultimately last more than 3 decades. His younger brother stayed behind bars on his life sentence. Under the terms of his deal, Kenneth became eligible for parole after 25 years, but there has been no public confirmation that he was ever released. For Ronald, the years on death row were spent fighting the sentence. His attorneys filed appeal after appeal, challenging the conviction and the death penalty. They raised legal issues, questioned aspects of the trial, and argued that his history, mental state, and youth at the time of his first murder should weigh against execution. Each attempt failed. The Florida Supreme Court rejected his petitions, and lower courts declined to overturn the verdict. By the time his final appeal was denied in January 2026, Ronald had been under a death sentence for more than 35 years. On January 9, 2026, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Ronald's death warrant, the first execution order issued in the state that year. The date was set for Tuesday, February 10, 2026, at Florida State Prison near Stark in Bradford County. After decades of legal motion, the countdown was suddenly specific: day, time, place. The morning of February 10th began like every other day on death row, except everyone involved knew it would be his last. Ronald was 64 years old. He woke up at 7 o'clock, took a shower, and spent part of the morning reading the Bible. He received a single visit, his spiritual advisor, who met with him and prayed with him as the hours moved toward evening. His last meal had already been served the day before. Ronald requested hamburgers with French fries, a simple choice for a man whose case had been anything but simple. At 3 in the afternoon, prison staff removed him from his cell to begin the formal execution process. Florida uses a 3-drug lethal injection protocol: an initial sedative, a paralytic to stop breathing, and a final drug to stop the heart. Shortly before 6 p.m., Ronald was led into the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. He was secured to the gurney and the team began the difficult work of establishing intravenous lines. Witnesses later described the procedure as taking several minutes as they searched for a suitable vein and inserted the needles. At 6 o'clock, the drugs began to flow. Over the next 6 minutes, Ronald showed slight physical reactions, small movements, gasping, a tightening of his facial muscles, but he never spoke. He kept his eyes closed, his mouth set. When the warden asked if he had any final statement, Ronald said only, "I'm sorry. That's all I can say. Thank you." It was a brief apology, far shorter than the decades his victims' families had spent living with what he had done. Among the witnesses in the room that night were Thomas and Nancy Sheridan, Michael Sheridan's brother and sister. They had grown up in upstate New York and had watched the case drag on for more than 30 years. Over those decades, they wrote letters to governors, called offices, and fought to make sure the sentence would eventually be carried out. For them, the execution marked an end to an extraordinarily long wait, though whether it brought the closure they had hoped for is a question only they can answer. At 6:30 p.m., a physician pronounced Ronald Palmer Heath dead. A life that had pivoted to murder at 16, escaped full punishment once through early parole, and then circled back into another killing, ended strapped to a gurney, watched by the family of one of the men he had left in the woods decades earlier. You've just seen how one man's violence as a teenager didn't end with a 30-year sentence. It spilled forward into another murder, another trial, and 35 years on death row before the state finally stepped in. Ronald Palmer Heath is only one of the 16 names on the 2026 execution list, and his case alone shows how long these stories can stretch and how tangled they become once the system gets involved. If you're still here after that, you're clearly not just watching for the shock factor. You're following the full arc, the early crime, the missed chances, the appeals that drag on for decades, and the moment the death warrant finally turns all of that into a date and time. We've gone through 2 executions so far. There are 14 more. Each one has its own path. Some men were almost killed themselves before they ever picked up a weapon. Some walked out of jail when they shouldn't have, and some spent most of their lives waiting to see if the state would ever actually go through with what a jury decided. So don't treat this as a one-off video and disappear. If you want to understand what the death penalty really looked like across the United States in 2026, not just the headlines, but the human chain of decisions that leads from a first arrest all the way to a lethal injection, stay with this series. We're moving case by case, not rushing the details. And by the time we reach the last name on that list, you'll have seen exactly how 16 different lives ended in the same room. Next up, we're going into the 3rd execution of the year, a Katrina survivor who carried his trauma from New Orleans into a nightclub in Oklahoma City and turned a punch in the mouth into a highway ambush that left 2 men dead. If you don't want to miss how that story starts or how it ends, make sure you're locked in before we move on. Case 3. Kendrick Antonio Simpson. Kendrick Antonio Simpson's life started in one of the roughest environments in America. He was born in 1980 and grew up in the 9th Ward of New Orleans, a neighborhood where poverty, crime, and drugs were part of the landscape. By his mid-teens, violence had already become part of his behavior. At 16, he carried out a home invasion robbery and shot a store owner at point-blank range. The victim survived, but the incident showed clearly how quickly Simpson was willing to reach for a gun. In 2004, his life nearly ended. Simpson was shot in the head, abdomen, and leg. He fell into a coma, went through 16 surgeries, and somehow survived. He came out of that trauma with lasting physical damage and deep paranoia. As if that weren't enough, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans the following year. The storm destroyed his home, left him stranded for days without food or water, and forced him to seek refuge in a convention center, along with thousands of other displaced residents. His city was gone. His body was broken. Whatever stability he might have had disappeared. By late 2005, Simpson relocated to Oklahoma City as a Katrina refugee. A fresh start on paper, but he carried every wound from New Orleans with him. On the night of January 15, 2006, he went out with 2 friends, Jonathan Dalton and Latango Robertson, in Dalton's white Monte Carlo. Before they headed to a popular hip-hop club called Fritzy's, Simpson stopped at home to change clothes. That was when he grabbed an AK-style assault rifle and brought it along, placing it in the trunk. The rifle could be reached from the back seat. It was there, waiting. The 3 men first attended a private party. When they left, Simpson put the rifle in the trunk and drove with his friends to Fritzy's, arriving close to midnight. Inside, the club was crowded, loud, full of people looking for a normal night out. As Simpson walked through, he passed 3 men, London Johnson, Anthony Jones, and Glenn Palmer. One of them made a comment about the Chicago Cubs cap Simpson was wearing. Prosecutors later said the remark was tied to gang symbolism, the hat associated with a rival group. Whether that was accurate or just street tension, Simpson took it as a challenge. He went back to his table and told Dalton and Robertson that someone had given him trouble about his hat. A few moments later, Simpson approached Palmer, Jones, and Johnson again. This time the confrontation escalated. According to witnesses, he threatened them, saying he was going to chop them, a slang term for shooting someone with an AK-47. He walked away, then returned a third time and extended his hand toward Palmer, as if trying to shake and settle the issue. Palmer responded by punching Simpson in the mouth and knocking him to the floor. Humiliated in front of a crowded club and already on edge, Simpson told his friends he wanted to leave. The 3 men walked out to the Monte Carlo in the parking lot. Outside, they ran into some women who were also leaving Fritzy's. The women told them to follow them to a nearby 7-Eleven on 23rd Street and Portland. Simpson, Dalton, and Robertson drove there and parked behind the store. When they arrived, they saw Palmer, Jones, and Johnson drive in too, in Palmer's Chevrolet Caprice. Dalton tried to calm Simpson. He urged him to let it go, but whatever switch had flipped inside Simpson when he hit the floor at the club was still turned on. He wanted revenge. When Palmer's Caprice left the parking lot and headed for Interstate 44, Simpson ordered Dalton to follow. During the chase, Simpson, sitting in the front passenger seat, demanded that Robertson, in the back, hand him the rifle from the trunk. Robertson passed the weapon forward. Dalton followed the Caprice up onto the interstate, and then off at Pennsylvania Avenue. There, he pulled the Monte Carlo into the left lane, right alongside Palmer's car. Simpson leaned the rifle out of the open passenger window and opened fire. Palmer, driving, was hit 4 times. 1 round grazed his right shoulder, 2 struck the left side of his back, another pierced his chest. At first, he was conscious and able to speak. He knew he had been shot. He was terrified the shooters would come back. As blood filled his chest, his breathing grew labored. He started making gurgling sounds and eventually lost consciousness. Jones, in the front passenger seat, was hit multiple times, including shots to the head and torso. The medical examiner later testified that his injuries were not survivable. He likely died within seconds. In the chaos, Johnson tried to do whatever he could. He attempted CPR on both men. It didn't help. He flagged down a passing car, pleading for assistance. Palmer and Jones were pronounced dead at the scene. Dalton kept driving. They went to a residence in Midwest City, left the rifle, and switched vehicles. After that, the 3 men met up again with the women they had seen at Fritzy's, as if they were trying to fold the shooting back into a night out. Oklahoma City police didn't take long to identify Simpson as a suspect. During questioning, he admitted he had been at Fritzy's with Dalton and Robertson and that he had been punched, but he denied firing the shots. His friends told a different story. Dalton and Robertson were initially charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Facing their own possible death sentences, they later testified against Simpson at trial. The trial took place in 2007 in Oklahoma County District Court. Prosecutors laid out a clear timeline: the confrontation at the club, the threat to chop the other men, the decision to bring the rifle, the chase from the 7-Eleven, and the final burst of gunfire on the road. Dalton and Robertson testified about Simpson's anger, his order to follow the Caprice, and his demand for the rifle. The jury found Simpson guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder with malice aforethought and 1 count of shooting with intent to kill. After his conviction, Simpson began the long routine of filing appeals. His attorneys challenged aspects of the case and raised issues about his mental state, his traumatic background in New Orleans, and the shooting he had survived in 2004. None of those efforts were enough to overturn the verdict. For nearly 20 years, he remained on Oklahoma's death row. During that time, he earned his GED and wrote a book of poems, essays, and short stories. In one of his reflections, he wrote about his children and the pain he had caused, reflecting on how his choices had shaped their lives as much as they had shaped his victims' families. In late 2025, his case moved from the realm of appeals to a fixed end date. On November 19, 2025, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals issued an order setting his execution for February 12, 2026, at 10 o'clock in the morning. Once a date was on the calendar, everything that had felt abstract, legal motions, written arguments, years on the row, became concrete. There was now a countdown. On the morning of February 12th, Simpson woke up at 5 a.m. He took a shower and met with his spiritual advisor. Later, he was allowed a final visit with his family, 4 children and 1 granddaughter. They stayed with him until 8:30, sharing the last hours they would ever have together, divided by prison rules and execution protocol. For his last meal, Simpson chose a bacon cheeseburger, a large order of onion rings, and a strawberry milkshake, food that, for most people, would be forgettable, but in this context, becomes a detail people remember. Around 9:30, Simpson was escorted into the execution chamber. He was placed on a padded gurney and secured with straps. Through an opening in the wall, 3 intravenous lines were inserted to deliver the lethal drugs. Oklahoma uses a 3-drug lethal injection protocol, a sedative to induce unconsciousness, vecuronium bromide to stop breathing, and potassium chloride to stop the heart. Witnesses later described Simpson as appearing uncomfortable during the injection. In the first few minutes, he made slight movements, and his breathing turned irregular, signs that this was not a peaceful drift to sleep, but a controlled medical procedure ending a human life. At 10:33 a.m., officials pronounced Kendrick Antonio Simpson dead. He was 45 years old. In the viewing area were members of Glenn Palmer's family and Anthony Jones's sister, Talasha Jones. They had carried the losses from that night in 2006 for nearly 20 years, watching the case move from arrest to conviction, from appeals to a date on the calendar, and finally, to the moment where the state of Oklahoma took Simpson's life, in return for the lives he had taken on the highway outside Oklahoma City. Case 4. Melvin Trotter. Melvin Trotter's case is a story about addiction, poverty, and a crime so brutal that it stayed open like a wound in one Florida town for nearly 40 years. In 1986, Trotter was 25 years old. He had no formal education, no stable career, and his life had been swallowed by the crack epidemic that devastated communities across the United States. In Palmetto, Florida, he was known as another local man, drifting on the streets, committing small thefts, and hustling for enough money to feed his addiction. The pattern was familiar: minor crimes, little bursts of cash, more drugs. Each decision pushed him further away from anything resembling a normal life. On June 16, 1986, he walked into a small neighborhood grocery store that had been part of Palmetto for more than 3 decades. The store belonged to 70-year-old V. Langford, a shopkeeper known and respected by customers and workers in the area. She and her husband had run the business for years. After his death, she kept going alone, opening the doors every day, serving a community she had watched grow and change. She knew many of her customers by name. One of them was Melvin. Langford knew his situation. She knew he struggled with drugs and had watched him grow up in the area. On previous occasions, she had seen him slip items under his clothes, stealing from her shelves. She could have called the police, but she chose not to. She pretended not to notice, perhaps hoping he would eventually stop, or simply trying to avoid sending someone she knew to jail. On that June day, it was clear that something had shifted. Trotter entered the store and began taking valuable items again, hiding them in his sweater as he moved through the aisles. While he did, VA was in the meat section, arranging merchandise. She called him over. She had reached her limit. She confronted him directly about the thefts, telling him she knew what he had been doing. She demanded that he leave her store and warned him that if he came back and continued stealing, she would finally call the police. It was the kind of warning many shopkeepers have given countless times. In most cases, it ends with an argument, maybe a shove, maybe a broken window. In this case, it triggered something far worse. Under the influence of drugs and desperation, Trotter grabbed a butcher knife from the store. He seized the elderly woman and attacked her. He held her by the neck and drove the knife into her abdomen again and again. The wounds were catastrophic, deep, tearing, exposing organs. Despite the savagery of the assault, V did not lose consciousness right away. She fell to the floor at the back of the store, bleeding heavily, her injuries visible and horrifying. Trotter ignored her suffering. He moved to the cash register, grabbed about $100 in cash and food stamps, and fled, carrying away the small amount of money he had wanted all along. Shortly after, a truck driver walked into the store. Instead of a routine stop for groceries, he found Langford lying on the floor, in agony. In a final act of clarity and strength, she was able to answer questions from him and from officers who soon arrived on scene. She told them she knew the man who had attacked her. She described him as a short African-American man wearing a Tropicana Company ID badge with the name Melvin. It was enough to point investigators in a very specific direction. Langford was rushed to the hospital. Surgeons attempted emergency procedures to save her life. She held on for hours. Ultimately, the damage was too severe. She died of cardiac arrest following surgery, her body unable to recover from the massive trauma inflicted by the knife. Back in Palmetto, the investigation moved fast. Police traced the name Melvin to his workplace at a nearby plant. From there, the picture came together quickly. Detectives found strong physical evidence tying Trotter to the crime. A palm print inside the store matched his. Clothing with bloodstains consistent with the victim was recovered. Witnesses reported seeing him soon after the attack smoking crack, with cash and food stamps wrapped in a red bandana, the same kind of items taken from the register. He did not leave town, did not attempt a sophisticated escape. He simply rolled his stolen money into more drugs. Within days, he was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and armed robbery. At trial, prosecutors presented the case as an example of extreme violence directed at a vulnerable victim. They described the attack in detail, the theft, and the callousness with which Trotter stepped over a 70-year-old woman he had just stabbed, focused only on the register. They argued that he had turned a petty theft into a deadly assault, and that her age and his actions warranted the harshest penalty the law allowed. The defense did not dispute that Trotter was responsible for the attack. Instead, they tried to explain him. They told the jury about his background, a childhood marked by abuse and abandonment, a low IQ, years of addiction that had reshaped his brain and his ability to control impulses. They pointed out that he had held a formal job at a plant, evidence that he had once tried to participate in normal life, but that crack had eventually dominated his choices. They argued that he acted under the influence of that addiction, impulsively, without fully grasping what he was doing. They asked the jury to see him as more than the horror of that day. On May 18, 1987, the jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to death. Compared to many capital cases, the timeline from crime to sentencing was short. But what came after would stretch much longer than anyone in that courtroom could have imagined. The central question people later asked when they looked at this case was simple. How did someone sentenced to death in the late 1980s end up being executed almost 40 years later? The answer lies in a mix of legal strategy, broader death penalty politics, and state-level decisions about how often execution warrants should be signed. Over the years, Trotter's attorneys filed appeal after appeal. They challenged parts of the conviction, raised constitutional claims, and argued that his mental state and background made the death sentence inappropriate. The legal system allowed those appeals to be heard. Courts responded, sometimes denying outright, sometimes granting limited relief. In 1993, Trotter was even granted a new trial. For some, that would have been a chance to walk away with a lesser sentence. For him, it ended in the same place. He was retried and again sentenced to death. While his case moved slowly through the courts, Florida itself went through changes in how often it carried out executions. There were stretches of time when governors signed very few warrants, sometimes only one execution in an entire year. Those political and administrative choices meant that death row inmates could sit for decades waiting to see whether their names would ever move to the top of the list. Trotter's case became one of the oldest in the state, a symbol of how long the process can stretch between sentencing and the ultimate punishment. By the mid-2020s, Florida's approach to executions shifted again. Governor Ron DeSantis began signing more warrants, and in 2025, the state carried out 19 executions, the highest number of any state that year. That context matters when we look at what happened next, because it shows that Trotter's case didn't suddenly appear on the governor's desk after 40 years by accident. It was part of a larger push. On Friday, January 23, 2026, DeSantis signed Melvin Trotter's death warrant. The date was set for February 24, 2026. For a man who had already spent nearly 4 decades on death row, it meant that the long stretch of uncertainty had finally ended. There was now a fixed point on the calendar. February 24, 2026, began early for Trotter. He was 65 years old. At 5 in the morning, he woke up, showered, and prepared for the hours ahead. According to reports, he did not receive any visitors in his final hours. Whatever connections he might have had outside the prison either no longer existed or chose not to come. His last meal was simple, almost modest: fish, cornbread, cake, and a soft drink. It was served to him hours before the execution. At around 5 p.m., staff transferred him within Florida State Prison, moving him closer to the execution chamber. 1 hour later, at 6 p.m., he was escorted into the chamber itself. He was placed on a gurney and restrained with leather straps at the wrists, ankles, and chest. 2 intravenous lines were inserted into his arms. In an adjacent room, separated by a wall and a glass window, the execution team and medical personnel monitored the process carefully. Before the drugs were administered, Trotter was asked if he had any final words. Witnesses said he remained silent for about 30 seconds, as if weighing whether to speak. In the end, he declined to make a statement. There were no public last words to record, no final message to the victim's family, no explanation, no apology. After that pause, the execution proceeded. The lethal injection began to flow through the IV lines. Witnesses noted that Trotter moved slightly for several minutes as the drugs took effect. Then his body grew still. At around 6:20 p.m., a doctor stepped forward to check for signs of life and pronounced him dead. A case that had started with a knife in a small store in 1986 ended on a gurney in 2026, almost 40 years later. For the people of Palmetto who remembered Via Langford, the woman who opened her store every day for decades, who tolerated small thefts rather than call police on someone she knew, and who died after finally saying she'd had enough, the execution marked the formal close of a story they had carried for most of their lives. For observers of the death penalty system, Trotter's case stood as an example of how slowly, and sometimes unevenly, capital punishment is applied, with a single crime stretching across generations, from the mid-1980s crack years all the way to an execution in 2026. Case 5. Billy Leon Pierce. To understand why Florida executed Billy Leon Pierce in 2026, you have to go back to a single traffic stop in Fort Pierce on a January night more than 3 decades earlier, and to the 18-year-old behind the wheel. In January 1991, Pierce was only 84 days past his 18th birthday. He already had a criminal record, at least a dozen prior arrests, and he was on probation for earlier offenses. To the Fort Pierce Police Department, he wasn't an unknown name. He was another young man at the edge of the system, one slip away from going back to prison. On the night of January 18th, he was driving a dark blue 1979 Monte Carlo, the wrong way, down a one-way street in downtown Fort Pierce. That simple mistake brought him into contact with someone who had spent his life moving in the opposite direction, toward discipline and service. Officer Danny Thomas Parrish was 29 years old. He had grown up in Indiana, moved to Fort Pierce with his family, and built a life around responsibility. He was an Eagle Scout. He served in the Army as a mechanic, working on lowboy rigs. In 1984, he joined the Fort Pierce Police Department as a mechanic, keeping patrol cars running. Then, in 1987, 2 officers were killed in an ambush. That loss changed him. He decided to become a police officer himself. By the time he crossed paths with Pierce, Parrish had been working full-time as an officer for only a couple of years. He was preparing for deployment in Operation Desert Storm and hoped to start a family with his wife, Mirtha, who worked as a victim advocate for the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office. People who knew him remember him as someone who loved helping others and wanted to make a difference. Some believed he would have become police chief if he had lived. Around 11 p.m. that night, Parrish spotted Pierce's Monte Carlo going the wrong way. He turned on his lights and pulled the car over. Parrish radioed the license plate number, a routine step for a traffic stop, then stepped out of his patrol vehicle. He approached the driver's side and asked for identification. Pierce didn't have a valid driver's license. He was on probation and knew that being caught driving without a license could send him back behind bars. Panicked, he started giving false names, trying to stay one step ahead of the system. Parrish checked the aliases. Nothing came back. At that point, the officer told Pierce to get out of the car so he could arrest him for driving without a license. What happened next took less than a minute. but it would define both men's lives. As Parrish tried to place handcuffs on Kearse, the metal struck Kearse under the eye. In interviews with detectives later, Kearse claimed the cuffs hit him accidentally, that the impact shocked and angered him. He said he turned around, shoved Parrish, and asked, "What's wrong, man?" According to his version, Parrish then reached for his gun, but Kearse got to it first. He seized the officer's service weapon and pointed it at him. Parrish, disarmed, and suddenly the one at the wrong end of a gun, raised his hands and pleaded for his life. "Come on, man, don't do it," he said, according to what Kearse himself later told investigators. In that moment, 2 lives hung in the balance. Kearse would later tell detectives, "It was him or me." The way prosecutors and the victims' families see it, what he did next wasn't a panicked flinch. It was a deliberate execution. Kearse fired the gun again and again. He pulled the trigger 14 times. 9 bullets struck Parrish's body. 4 more lodged in his bulletproof vest. As Parrish lay on the asphalt, bleeding out, Kearse stood over him and continued to shoot. Florida State Attorney Tom Backerdall, years later, described it bluntly. Danny came upon a wolf. In his description, with Parrish's life seeping out of his body, Kearse stood over him with his own gun and fired 13 more rounds into him. When the shots stopped, Kearse climbed back into his Monte Carlo and sped away, leaving the mortally wounded officer on the ground. A taxi driver nearby heard the gunfire and saw the Monte Carlo speeding off. Finding Parrish lying in the road, the driver grabbed the fallen officer's radio and called urgently for help. Parrish was rushed to the hospital, but the damage was too severe. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The traffic stop that should have ended with a citation or an arrest now stood as one of the most shocking events in Fort Pierce's history. Because Parrish had radioed the plate, investigators knew exactly where to start. The license traced back to Kearse. Police went to his home that same night. He was arrested and, after waiving his rights, confessed to the shooting. He told detectives about the handcuffs hitting his face, his fear of going back to prison, and his belief that it was him or me. He admitted that Parrish had begged him not to shoot, and that he pulled the trigger anyway. The reaction in Fort Pierce was immediate and intense. Parrish was deeply respected within the force and the community. His murder hit like a shockwave. The funeral drew crowds, with officers from multiple departments and citizens packing in to pay their respects. Florida's governor at the time, Lawton Chiles, visited Fort Pierce to meet Parrish's family, presented Merthyr with an American flag, and later, the city installed a life-sized statue of Parrish outside the police station. A nearby park was named in his honor. His sister later described how the trauma shattered their parents and forced the family to move out of state. When the case went to trial in October 1991, much of the evidence wasn't in dispute. Kearse had taken Parrish's gun. He had fired over a dozen shots. Parrish had pleaded for his life. The question was what penalty the jury would choose. The defense argued that the case was being aggravated primarily by the number of shots, not by some specific intent to target law enforcement. Kearse's attorney tried to frame the encounter as a tragic collision between 2 lives, 2 ships passing in the night that unfortunately collided, not a targeted ambush of a cop. The prosecution rejected that narrative completely. In their view, this wasn't a split-second accident. It was an execution carried out with cold, methodical intent. The jury found Kearse guilty of first-degree murder and armed robbery. At the penalty phase, 11 jurors voted for death, 1 for life, an 11-to-1 recommendation in favor of the death penalty. The judge followed that recommendation and sentenced Kearse to die. For the Parrish family, the sentence was both a recognition of the horror they had lived through and the start of a very long wait. The legal story didn't end there. In the years that followed, Kearse's case went back up through the system. The Florida Supreme Court determined that the trial court had not properly instructed the jury on specific aggravating factors that supported the death sentence. As a result, the court ordered a new sentencing hearing. That second penalty phase once again ended with a death sentence. The jury and judge reaffirmed the decision that Kearse should be executed for killing Parrish. From that point on, the case entered the familiar pattern of capital appeals. Kearse's attorneys filed motions challenging different aspects of the trial and penalty, including whether he had received a fair sentencing and whether his intellectual capacity made him ineligible for execution. In more recent years, experts evaluated him and concluded he had intellectual disability, raising questions about whether executing him would violate constitutional limits on punishing people with such impairments. His legal team argued that these findings should halt the execution. Courts disagreed. The Florida Supreme Court rejected his latest appeals and declined to stop the execution. On the federal level, his lawyers sought relief from the U.S. Supreme Court. On the same day he died, the court turned down their request for a stay, clearing the final legal obstacles. The governor did not intervene. Meanwhile, for Mertha and others close to Parrish, the decades since 1991 had been marked by grief and a determination to see the case through. She recalled that at sentencing, Kearse turned around, winked, and smiled at her, a gesture she saw as mocking, proof of a lack of remorse. That moment fueled her drive to attend the execution 35 years later. "It's been a long time coming," she told reporters shortly before his death. "I can't see keeping him alive for over 35 years while Danny just had seconds. It's simply not right." On January 31st, 2026, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Kearse's death warrant. The document set his execution for March 3, 2026, by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Rayford. DeSantis had been openly pushing for more executions, arguing that some crimes were so horrific that the death penalty was the only fitting punishment, and that families had waited too long for closure. In 2025, Florida had executed 19 prisoners, a modern record for the state. Kearse's warrant fit into that renewed push. As March approached, the state prepared. Advocacy groups highlighted the case as an example of what they saw as harsh and outdated capital punishment policy. Law enforcement organizations pointed to it as a necessary enforcement of the law when an officer is murdered in the line of duty. In Fort Pierce, Parrish's name and statue stood as reminders of why the warrant existed at all. On March 3, 2026, Kearse was brought into the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. He was 53 years old. Florida uses a 3-drug lethal injection protocol, a sedative, a paralytic agent to stop breathing, and a drug that causes cardiac arrest. Witnesses watched as he was strapped to the gurney and IV lines were inserted into his arms. Outside, reporters gathered. Inside, officials moved through procedures they had now carried out many times under DeSantis's administration. The Department of Corrections later reported that Kearse was pronounced dead at 6:24 p.m. His execution was the third in Florida that year, and the fifth in the United States overall. It also marked the first of 3 executions scheduled in Florida for the month of March alone, signaling that the state's assembly line of death, as some critics called it, was continuing at full speed. For Mertha, watching through the glass, it closed a chapter that had been open since she was a young wife, with her whole future ahead of her. She and Danny had married in the early 1980s, after he sought her parents' permission, in keeping with her traditional Cuban upbringing, even being chaperoned on their first date by one of her brothers. They had planned a life together, hoped to have children, and had those plans violently cut short when he stopped an 18-year-old driving the wrong way down a street. In the years after Danny's death, she eventually remarried and raised 2 daughters, but she never forgot the man who had stood over her husband and fired shot after shot as he begged for his life. For the broader public, Kearse's execution raised familiar questions. Does carrying out a death sentence 35 years after a crime bring real closure, or simply mirror violence with more violence? For law enforcement, it was a signal that killing a police officer still brings the system's harshest punishment, even when the case takes decades to resolve. And for Florida's death row, it was another name removed from a list of roughly 250 inmates, as the state continued to move through warrants signed under a governor determined to keep the execution chamber busy. We've just walked through 5 executions carried out in the United States in 2026. 5 names, 5 sets of crimes, trials, and final moments, taken from a list of 16 people the state has already put to death this year. Each one of these stories ends the same way, on a gurney, under fluorescent lights, with a heartbeat that stops on the state's schedule, not theirs. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't just shock content. It's a record. What we've covered tonight are only the first 5 cases. There are 11 more executions on that list. Different states, different crimes, different last meals, and very different final words. Some of those men spent nearly half a century on death row before the state finally carried out their sentence. Others went from sentencing to execution in a fraction of that time. In the next videos, we're going to break down all of them, the same way we've done here. So here's the deal. If you want the full picture of what the death penalty really looked like in 2026, every name, every case, every last statement, make sure you're locked in. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with this series. I'm not rushing through 16 lives in one upload just to hit a runtime. We're taking our time, case by case, so you can see exactly how these stories start, how they spiral into violence, and how they end inside an execution chamber. When the next part drops, we'll move on to the next 5 executions on that list. Different crimes, new states, and some of the most disturbing final hours you'll ever hear described. After that, the third video will close out the remaining 6, including the oldest person Florida has ever executed. If you don't want to miss any of that, this is your moment to stay with the channel. You've seen how the first 5 names on the 2026 execution list ended. The rest are coming.